So I wanted to answer a really good question that was asked in response to my last video on direct presence. And basically this question is about what some have referred to as the dweller on the threshold. And it's really the way I can conceive this, or will for this video, is that the threshold is also this place where your personal matrix is enmeshed with the capital M matrix. And the threshold, when you start to cross and you get to that point, well, there can be a couple thresholds, but for this video, what I'm going to talk about are really like the symptoms of reaching the edge of your own personal matrix and how that relates or interweaves with the collective capital M matrix, and then the exit itself. So if you're new here, my name is Shannon, and I've done a couple of videos on this previously, a few videos on like the matrix specifically, especially for gifted and creative empaths, so you might want to check those out. And importantly, I encourage you to, of course, always just use your own judgment. Do your own coherence testing based on anything I or somebody else says about what this can look like or how it might happen for you. Always coherence test against your own experience and your highest understanding. So with that being said, I think there's three main, or not main, like there could be other ones, but three really big ones that are coming through for me as symptoms that might start happening as you really approach the edge of your own matrix. And two of them will sound more familiar, and then one is maybe less obvious, or I wouldn't have expected it, but it makes total sense. I wouldn't have expected it, but it makes total sense. So before I get into that, I just want to talk about the fact that we have our own personal matrix, or several of them, interlocking matrices, that themselves then kind of plug into the larger collective capital M matrix. And the distinction here is that we can do a lot of the work of kind of like dissolving our own personal matrix without, or how should I say this, kind of independently of where we might function or sit within the capital M matrix. So for example, you may have like a naturally kind of so-called rebellious personality, like especially if you're neurodivergent, neurocomplex as well, like asking questions, analyzing, having like entertaining new connections, and all of that type of activity is kind of innate. And so that in itself is not necessarily yet like a challenge to the capital M matrix in the sense that I'm going to be talking about. Because there could be many ways in which you are still like, that still performs well for you within your own personal matrix, depending on your conditioning and the circumstances that you grew up in and your caregivers and your network and all of that. So it's kind of like questioning programming, but maybe not necessarily in a way that you're still locked into larger programming or not. It's independent. I think a key distinction here might be whether or not you end up employing that type of questioning for purposes of larger spiritual service. So again, within the context of this topic, this video, the larger capital M matrix isn't necessarily going to be taking notice of the kinds of things you do, and this is innately part of your personality, and because it's not yet playing on that higher spiritual field, so to speak. So, but the point I want to talk about is the way I'm conceiving this is literally where you have started to do a lot of the work of unraveling the various personal matrices that you are caught up in. So this is personal conditioning. It is kind of not yet or necessarily like the capital C collective conditioning, although there's always like correspondence and relation, but specific egoic things based on specific experiences you had developmentally or whatever personal situations you're in, doing a lot of that kind of like egoic work to challenge yourself and like moving past your own limiting beliefs about yourself and so on. And then I think you've gone through some dark night of the soul or an elongated dark night of the soul. You've done a lot of personal work, and there does get to be a point where now you really may be at the edges of your own personal matrix. And the work now is really about kind of seeing properly and dissolving where needed, like places where you don't want to tangle with the collective M matrix. So I have to explain that a little bit better. So there may be aspects of your egoic personality in service to yourself, just developmentally, that they may already align very well with the matrix, or they may already just not be in alignment with the matrix. But overcoming those kinds of challenges or blocks on that kind of personal level is not yet the same as challenging the way that they function in the capital M matrix. So for example, let's say that you are on an authentic path where you feel really called to work in healthcare, and you are authentically drawn to, like a mainstream healthcare system, like you are drawn to the path of Western medicine and so on, and you train as a physician in a specific field. The Matrix loves that. Like, that's not to like judge it in a certain way, but do you see what I mean? Like, that's not yet going to challenge anything, even though that could be your authentic path if you're authentically choosing it in that way. So do you see what I mean? But then you can see, and we have lots of great examples of this too, of people who did train authentically in a Western medicine path. And this is not to say, I'm not like making a blanket statement about that path, but I'm just pointing out the aspect of like when you reach the edge of your own personal matrix. So we have lots of great examples of like physicians who then, wanted to like, they're basically like turned into authors basically because they need to speak or share or communicate about specific aspects of what they've learned and so on. And again, depending on the context and what's being emphasized, that may or may not be like a challenge to collective M matrix. Okay, so that was just a little like contextual preamble. Let me know if that raises like new questions, or there's a couple points where maybe it needs a bit more detail in the explanation. But the main point being that the matrix isn't really going to start noticing you until you're at that point where you're unraveling the last bits of like where your personal matrix unfolds, because that's where it really connects with the capital M matrix. Right? It makes sense, right? Because all of these little kinds of like, if you think of it as like a big tapestry, like a big quilt or something, there's all these like little individual patches, and then together they compose this larger fabric. And so it's not until you really start reaching the ends of your own threads that's when you're really at a point of like, okay, now you may also be leaving like the collective matrix. So let me know if that makes sense. Like, I think the important detail here is that you may still be engaged with many parts of your own personal matrix, but parts of those may already not deal with the collective matrix, right? It's possible to have broken free and created like holes and disengaged from many aspects of your personal matrix and the collective matrix, without yet engaging what I'm trying to talk about here, which is like the last threads, so to speak. Okay, so I'm just gonna move on now to like 3 kinds of like signs or symptoms that I feel are indicative of this. There are likely others, there's other ways of talking about this, so let me know also based on your own experience. But the main thing that's going on in the background here now is that things can start to get really wonky, like in general. Like Because what's happening is that, as within, so without, right? So as you begin to question and replace your own interpretive paradigms, you're literally making a paradigm switch, right? It feels like that's kind of like the downward projection of what's happening on a higher level, which is that you are now moving into a different rule space. Like you're moving into a dimension where, in some sense, like you are going to be subject to different laws, or it's like additional laws, or maybe it's a stricter application of certain laws. Because there's no like, well, there could be a hard discontinuity, but in general, right, there's a reflection of everything. But there's just something in here about definitely the way that the laws work for you, like it's starting to shift. Not in the sense that you're not subject to these laws, like I'm not saying that, but it's just the way that they will kind of like appear and challenge and enforce in your own life. Like you're being called to um, like honor them or something in a different way. Or maybe a better way to put it is that you will now have access to a different perspective on the way that these laws work. Okay, so I'll start with like two of the more obvious or like you might expect them types of symptoms. And I'm not really able to like speak to some super large context about like how or why this is happening in the way that it's happening, but like I'm just going to try to stay on the level of experience and phenomena. And so the first one that I would say happens for sure is that you may encounter, like, again, wonky. So you may encounter unusual patterns that kind of like appear as if they're trying to act as obstacles on your path. And the difference here is that like this goes beyond, any kind like the natural assortment of like challenges we might encounter in 3D life, no matter what, right? Any kind of accident could happen to anyone. So this is more than like just like a one-off kind of weird thing or accident or something that is kind of like statistically already spread out through the population. So these are like kinds of patterns that may feel like the effect is to try to like keep you from speaking up, or maybe literally to keep you from moving, literally or symbolically. And I think in another video, I might have mentioned like the way one of these was happening for me, but I had a very, very unusual sequence of events relating to like my car at the time, and while I was also in the process of like moving to another city. So kind of like this literal symbolism of like moving, right? Six of Swords type of activity. And again, beyond just the level of like statistical chance that you would expect, but kind of orchestrated in a way that felt like it was almost working like a language, right? Like discursively a pattern. And again, wonky and unusual in the sense that these were incidents that had never occurred for me before in my life, or even in people like I knew, like never in my family growing up, just wasn't in my orbit at all. And then, so a whole range of things, but then also like in the new city, for example, like having this random like speeding ticket, having random some there were some strange things that happened with parking. There was a strange thing with my tire. There was actually a literal accident. And just like compressed into this very small window of time. So highly suspect. And that's not even getting into the part of the story that will probably sound crazy to some people, but I think I mentioned that in another video, but we'll see. I might add it. Okay, so moving on though, the next kind of symptoms though is kind of works a little bit to counterbalance that, because I think that what's happening when you get to the edge, when you get to this threshold, it's like, the capital M matrix is kind of always monitoring anyway. Like I feel like there's kind of like a monitoring of where you are in your sleep status. And with these last threads, of course, it's kind of like lights are set off, like alerts are set off in some kind of metaphysical sense. So there's just more activation all around, right? So part of this activation I think it will be like you might start receiving kinds of either signs or synchronicities, or they could feel like explicit messages or explicit small acts of like divine intervention. Again, almost as like a counterbalance to the events that kind of appear as like as if they're trying to be explicit obstacles on your path. So again, just more activation and in a wonky sense, because now it's kind of like reflecting the different application of certain laws or a different perspective on how these laws are actually working and how you intersect with them. And so, just to continue with that example with my car, I also started receiving very explicit kinds of like messaging from my dad, who has passed, but who was also, among his many careers, he was a polymath. He was also a driving instructor for different types of licenses. He had a business doing this. And so I was starting to receive like some events, signals that were happening, also very tied around like all of this strange activity that was happening with the car. So a very strange kind of conjunction. And I guess I'll share this. Some of you might just think this is crazy, but it's just way too hyper specific that it's under, you couldn't make this up. I mean, you've heard it before, but like when it actually happens, and when it's actually happening because of the timing, because of the specificity, and because it's like there isn't really any other interpretation. Like it's beyond statistical chance. But one of his other careers, he was also an electrician, right? And so he used like some electrical outlets, let's say, to like just create some kind of like signaling, and it happened like specifically around like the car accident that I was in. I had a lamp that it had a very unique bulb, so I hadn't got around to replacing it yet, and that light was on when I came home, and it had never worked, like it had stopped working, right? And I tested it later on too, like, is this some weird fluke? No, I couldn't get it back on. And then it happened again after like a series of events kind of resolved themselves regarding this accident. So again, that's just a tiny example, but it's to illustrate like the level of activation that I think starts happening when you're in this place. Okay, so let's move on to the third, maybe less expected symptom of being at this edge, at this threshold. And again, remember, what I think is part of what's happening here is that these are also symptoms of the transition to, again, the different perspective or different location you may be moving into with respect to how certain universal laws work. And it's almost as if the threshold also kind of represents like this final kind of like asking point of like, you want to give up, you want to move past these specific kinds of personal challenges for this and this reason in your own development, in your own individuation. And then in return, there's a new responsibility as well. And so you're at this point of like seeing that to fully accept it. Because again, new application of the laws, being called to a higher standard is going to be in effect. Okay, so let's move on to the third kind of area that I think might happen. And again, there could be lots of other symptoms as well, but these, I just wanted to like point out these really quickly to kind of like help answer this question. So given that you are in this path or space of like kind of like clearing out your own personal conditioning and your own personal lines of karma and so on, you're likely already you're a student on the path. You're studying something. You're studying maybe explicitly in certain kinds of spiritual traditions, or this is your own research, or you are working with like a spiritual mentor, spiritual coach, or some combination of all of this. So you're in these spaces. And one of the symptoms of making this transition from the kind of like the personal world of meaning and the personal matrix into an expanded collective, well, that's in a different sense, meaning, sense of meaning, networks of meaning that now have, they reach new levels of responsibility. So you're also going to be moving across that threshold of your own personal um, private language. Sorry, Wittgenstein, but there is an aspect of private language for every individual. As much as language itself is already a very tried and true intersubjective phenomenon, but it needs to constantly be cured and constantly tuned. There's always some degree still of private language. And so when you start crossing this threshold, I think that that aspect becomes challenged. And again, it's just a new area where it may need to be tuned because now you're kind of on levels of higher responsibility, literally new, wider areas of response, literally speaking, right? Responding. And so one of the thresholds that you are definitely crossing here relates to the use of language and the roles of language amongst other people who are in this space, whether they're also at the edge with you or they have already passed that, they're like further down on the path. There's going to be a new negotiation of the way that certain concepts are working for you or for them and intersubjectively on that new level. And this is like neither like good or bad. It's just neutral. It's just, you can think of it like a learning curve. It's kind of like when you have the duck rabbit image and you've just only ever seen the duck. Like pretend you're 6 or 7 or 8 or whenever you first ever saw that kind of duck rabbit image, or it was like the young woman, old woman image. There was a first time before you could see the other gestalt and actively switch between them. And I think that something like that is happening here too. So there is a first time when you have to learn like how to like flip the image, flip the gestalt in a way to actually see sort of like the negative space that's also composing the image. And I'm using this in an analogous sense, right? Analogical sense, sorry. And so returning to this theme of things just kind of going wonky, I think that like one of the ways in which this might appear in this context is that you may find yourself in a really like wonky kind of like pseudo conflict with somebody else in this space or further down on the path than you around something pertaining to the use of language or a specific concept or, speaking itself. Like, when do you speak? When do you not speak? What do you speak? What term? What word? What concept? Who are you speaking to? This is like a new arena because it's like that gestalt image and you're kind of like, it's just a new plane on which you kind of have to retune. And it is another type of co-calibration, which is why like I talk about that. That's so important. And I just feel like this is just another area in which the threshold is going to manifest itself as a particular kind of like wonky experience at the edge. So let me know how that resonates with you. Again, I'm not saying that I've laid out all the details here. I'm still kind of in this place myself, but this is definitely some of what you might expect. It's just this overall kind of like, if you think about this as a digital image, right? Like you've still got this image on your screen, but you've got like weird chunks of pixels kind of like dropping out in random intervals. And again, it's just kind of a function of how your own interpretive paradigm is being like retuned, recalibrated to be more of a reflection of like this next level, so to speak. And how do you exit this? Well, the primary thing is to know that these kinds of different experiences don't mean that you're wrong or that you've done something wrong. That's kind of like the old paradigm that you're moving out of. Your claim and your ambition and your aim here was for your own individuation, for further development authentically on your authentic path. So you have to trust that. Like, you have to trust and sort of find a new place of anchoring of like knowing that you're right, because now you're not taking those cues anymore from like merely collective signs. And so I'm not saying that those certain collective signs themselves were wrong, right? Like they are right on that level. So this is all about, again, it's that gestalt shift. It's like, because now you're moving into the place where you do see the duck and the rabbit and you can like see the gestalt. So I hope that has been useful. Again, let me know your questions, drop them below in the comments, and I'll see if I need to respond to something else. But basically, yeah, thanks for watching, and I will link the other related videos here. And yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time and joining my channel for this. And I would love to hear from you. So talk soon.